Chairman is late. Okay, we're recording. Cool. So thank you, folks. Welcome today to our spring series speakers, transportation and housing. My name is Keith Smith. I'm the chair of the Central Virginia Regional Housing Partnership. Thanks for joining us today for our transportation housing event. My computer's going crazy. Thank you, Lucinda. We would like to thank particularly Vermonte Homes who's sponsoring to this. Vermonte Homes make sure that your experience building with them is as wonderful as their final product. We've got a couple of rock star guests today, but I'm going to introduce the rock star guest, which would be Diantha McKeel, chair of the Regional Housing Transit Partnership, member of the Central Virginia Regional Housing Partnership, go Diantha, and Albemarle County Board of Supervisors, who will be moderating this event today. So I'm going to let Diantha introduce our two rock stars on transportation, and then we'll kick in a little bit later with some Q&A. So Diantha, the ball is in your park, madam.
Thank you, Keith, and I really appreciate the rock star part.
Yeah.
Keith and I we're going to tag team today. I do want to welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us today. And I'll introduce our speakers. We have Todd Littman, who is a founder and executive director of the Victoria Transport Policy Institute, which is an independent research organization dedicated to developing innovative solutions to transport problems. His work has expanded the range of impacts and options considered in transportation decision-making, improves evaluation methods, and makes specialized technical concepts accessible to large audiences. His research is used worldwide in transport planning and policy analysis. Welcome, Todd. We're thrilled you're here today with us. And our other panelist is Stephen Johnson, who is familiar to many of us. He's a planning manager at Jaunt, one of our Region 10's public transportation operators. He enhances regional mobility through planning, marketing research, and leveraging data and technology. Stephen has a master's degree in urban and environmental planning from the University of Virginia and works with regional partners to consider land use and planning to improve transportation options and access for all our residents. And we thank you very much for joining us as well, Stephen. And I'm going to just start off, just so everyone knows, I have a series of 6 questions that I'll be asking our panelists. And then the second half of our webinar, we want to take questions from the audience, the folks that are listening. And if you will, as we go through the webinar, type in your questions in the chat. Keith is going to handle that and sort of get those questions together for us in the second half of the event. And we'll be sharing those questions, and we'll make sure that any questions you have are answered as best we can. So with that, in an effort to keep us on time, I'll ask the first question. Traditionally, housing programs in the United States have measured housing affordability in terms of housing costs as a percentage of household income, with 30% of income being the standard measure of affordability. Do you believe this measure fully captures the true cost of affordable housing? And I'll kick that question off first to Todd. How about that?
Right. It's a very important question. Housing and transportation are the 2 largest expenditures in most household budgets. Housing is typically first and transportation is typically second. And so it works out that a cheap house is not truly affordable if it has particularly high transportation costs. If it's located in an area where people have to spend a lot of time and money traveling. So a lot of experts now recommend that instead of defining affordability as 30% of household budgets to housing, it's defined as 45% of household budgets devoted to housing and transportation combined. So households can make that assessment. They can say, I'm willing to pay a little bit more for a house with low transportation costs. And transportation costs are particularly risky to low income households because they're often unpredictable. So you can pretty much predict what your rent's going to be and maybe your utilities. But if you depend on automobile transportation, occasionally you face these large, unpredictable expenses when your car breaks down or you have a crash that can be hundreds or thousands of dollars. So what we find is low-income households in automobile-dependent areas where they're spending a lot of time and money on their vehicles are more likely to have financial crises, unpredictable expenses. So the new thinking takes into account both of those expense, those cost burdens.
Okay, great. Stephen, would you like to add?
Yeah, I agree with everything that Todd said. A couple points I would add, that the transportation cost is paid not only in dollars, but also in time. If I can only afford to take public transit, but that means my commute to work is going to take 5 or 10 times longer, then that's time that I'm losing to spend on other things. Todd mentioned predictability, and that's important when it comes to time as well. If I'm reliant on public transit to get to work, and I miss my transfer and wind up getting there 40 minutes late, and I lose my job, then in that case, the lack of transit equity can be a contributor to systemic poverty. Another factor I would mention is that often there's a strong correlation between transit access and other urban factors like walkability, density, proximity to services and shopping. And all those factors together have the potential to raise property values. So transit access can be a factor that displaces affordable housing units. So it's something else we have to keep in mind.
Okay, thank you. Another question. It seems that a strong relationship between housing affordability and transportation options, but as a local government, we struggle to provide public transportation options to many communities. Stephen, as a local transportation planner, can you explain why this is a struggle?
Yeah, so I think we do have some public transit options in our community, but I don't think they're very compelling transit options. So when we put ourselves in the shoes of somebody who's deciding whether to take transit or drive, I think there's really 4 factors that one would consider. The first would be the financial cost. Second would be the time cost. Third would be reliability. Can I rely on getting there on time? And the fourth, I think, would be flexibility. Will my transportation allow me to make a last-minute change to my schedule, to travel with a friend, to bring home a bunch of shopping, those kinds of things. So when we think about driving and transit in the context of those 4 factors, I think public transit's doing pretty well on the financial side. If you compare the cost of a bus pass to the total cost of ownership of an automobile, I think in most cases, public transit is going to come out ahead. So I think it's really those other areas where we're struggling. Now, if we want to improve that for public transit in our region, I think we need to approach it from 2 directions. Now, the first is one that we're all pretty familiar with, and that's transit investment and transit planning. So how many resources are we using to put buses out on the road? And then what kinds of decisions are we making about where to put those routes, what our frequencies are going to be, all that kind of stuff. And that's important, but I think where we've struggled in the past is that's all we've seen. An Albemarle planner might come to me and say, hey, we've got this community, there's a lot of cul-de-sacs, there's a lot of houses, and we're really struggling with our congestion. Can you put a public transit Band-Aid on this and fix it? Now, in that case, the game board is already set, and there's only so much that we can do as a player. But I think if we expand our idea of what transit planning is, and we think about things like density, so how can we take those A's and B's and cluster them together to make sure that when we put a bus out there, we're going to be able to cover a lot of trips? How can we consider road network connectivity as a part of transportation planning so that we don't have a bus that's snaking through a development to serve one person and wasting the time of everybody else on the bus? How can we make sure that we have a lot of multimodal nodes in our community so that when a bus drops somebody off, there's 20 places they can easily and comfortably walk to rather than, well, one destination and then a 500-foot parking lot and another destination, and then a highway and another destination, the bus is going to be a lot less effective in that scenario. So I think we've struggled with that in the past. We've had too narrow a view of transit planning. And I think if we expand that as a community and look for ways that we can shape the game board so that when the transit player does come along, they're going to be able to deliver more successful outcomes for the community, I think that could be a better approach.
Great. Todd, and we'll give you a chance to respond to that question too.
Right. I like to frame this in a positive way. And so the way I would describe it is that pretty much everybody benefits if we create a community where people don't need to drive everywhere. This is not to say that that everybody should go car free, that nobody should drive. But for a typical family, there are some local trips that if your neighborhood is well planned, you can do by walking and bicycling. And there should be good, frequent, convenient public transit so you can travel between neighborhoods efficiently without having to drive. And you only use your car when it really is the best option overall, considering all costs. That's particularly important for low-income families or people with disabilities who their ability to drive is constrained. So there's a let's call it a social equity imperative to make sure that any household that wants to live in a walkable, transit-friendly area has appropriate housing. The interesting example is pretty much any neighborhood, any small town or urban neighborhood that was built before 1950. So if you go back to the older neighborhoods, they're all very walkable. They have sidewalks on all the streets. You have local schools and parks and stores that were designed. The neighborhood was organized around the idea that at least some people will rely on walking. We lost that for a while, and now there's a number of, you could say, planning movements or approaches that are trying to reestablish that. We sometimes call it smart growth or new urbanism. The latest term is we talk about a 15-minute neighborhood, which means that most of what you need over the course of a week, you can reach within a 15-minute walk or short bike ride. And that's the type of planning. We're not saying everybody needs to live in that neighborhood. Maybe some people don't want to, but any household that wants to live with that combination really should have that opportunity.
Great, thank you. Next question. For several decades, single-family, car-dependent developments have been favored over more compact forms of development, not just in our region, but in cities and counties across the country. Why did single-family development become the preferred type of housing? And do you see the preference changing? And I'll flip back to Stephen.
Well, I suspect Todd might have a broader perspective on this, but in my experience, I think there's a lot of good reasons that justify that type of development. People like to have control over the space where they live. They like to have a space where their kids can play safely in the yard. Or in the case of a cul-de-sac, they want to reduce the amount of traffic, again, for safety reasons. So I think there are a lot of legitimate reasons that people have pursued that kind of development. And to Todd's point, I don't think we need to bar anybody from pursuing those kinds of opportunities if that's what we're interested in. But I do think it's important as a community that we're being honest about all of the trade-offs that come with that style of development. And one of the trade-offs is that it's very difficult to serve those kinds of communities with public transit. We faced that when we tried to put the Buckingham Connect route in place. There were definitely some neighborhoods that supported that better than others. So that can be a real challenge, and that's one of the trade-offs with those communities. Two other points I'd add real briefly is that I think it does mirror our social structures. So the single-family detached house is governed by a family unit. If you live in an apartment where you're sharing space with other people, I think that does require you to have different kinds of social relationships with the people around you. And And some people like that and some people don't. And the last point, I'm not an economist, but I understand that the single family detached house is a vehicle that we've tried to use to build a middle class, but I won't talk about that too much because that's not my area of expertise.
All right. Todd, would you like to respond? I'd love to hear your response.
Sure. Well, of course, there are many benefits of having a single family house, and having a car provides huge benefits to the people who do drive, but there are substantial costs. And so one way to think of it is that a single family house typically costs about 30% more than a townhouse and about twice as much as an apartment for the same floor area, because of the additional land costs and the additional infrastructure that's required. So if your zoning code says that this neighborhood is only single family housing, you're essentially saying we only welcome people who can afford that cost increment. So you're saying this neighborhood is excluding people with lower incomes. We are not accommodating the types of households that need lower priced housing types like apartments or condominiums and townhouses. Now, of course, it's complicated because a lot of single family homes actually get cheaper over time. You know, a 40 or 50-year-old house can be affordable, even if it's, single family. But if you're talking about how we're adding neighborhoods, if you're building new neighborhoods, those that allow what we call the missing middle or the compact housing types, townhouses and low-rise apartments, are going to be far more affordable and therefore far more inclusive. Now, another way to think about this is think about your life cycle. So certainly, if you're let's say a typical family, mom, dad, a couple kids, or some variant of that, it may make sense. Or you're a very enthusiastic gardener, it might make sense to have a single family house. That might be your ideal. On the other hand, when you're, say, you're a university student or just getting started in life with a low-wage job, or you have let's say a physical disability and you don't want to take on the burden of gardening, or when you're a senior and you want to downsize and you don't want all those responsibilities of the house, it makes a lot of sense to be part of let's say a condominium or a townhouse rather than a single family house. And it turns out less than half of all households are your classic parents and kids. That's actually about a third of households in most regions. And so it does make sense if you think of it from a life cycle perspective that most people are going to spend a good portion of their life wanting those more compact housing types, either because they're low income or because they don't want that additional responsibility of maintaining a house. So again, if we want to accommodate people's needs and we want to ensure that everybody has a suitable house, then it is very important to fill that gap, the missing middle types of housing that most communities have not been building, and to make sure that those are in very accessible places where if you want to minimize your driving, you can't afford a car, or you have a physical disability or something like that, that it's very important that the affordable housing that we're building be located in maximum accessibility multimodal neighborhoods.
Thank you. And we certainly in this area are missing that. We talk about the missing middle a lot. I appreciate that response. And I just want to let folks know, if you joined us, we're going to be taking questions and answers the second half of our webinar. So please put your questions into chat. Keith is following them and is keeping track of them for us. The next question, Looking to the future of transportation in our region, do you see any innovations in service delivery, such as methods for connecting people in suburban neighborhoods to fixed route transit options? And then that question was about suburban. I'd also like to ask if you have any suggestions on ways rural communities can be serviced, because certainly in our locality, in our region, we have suburban and we have rural as well as very urban. Stephen, I'll ask you to respond to that one first, please.
Sure. So as a transit practitioner, we get exposure to a lot of different kinds of technology. And for a long time, there have been two really predominant forms of public transit. One is the traditional fixed route bus that you're used to. It's got a published timetable and stops and all of that. And then we see demand response services, which is the majority of what we do here at Jaunt. And that involves calling ahead at least a day in advance to place your reservation. And then our schedulers work to try to take as many trips as they can and fit them on the buses that we have available. The fixed route options are a much more appropriate public transit option for dense urban cores. And we see that in downtown Charlottesville and urban Albemarle County. The demand response is a much more appropriate technology for more rural areas. And that's the majority of Jaunt's service area, are the counties surrounding Charlottesville and Albemarle. But there's a new technology that's coming down the pike that we're calling on-demand technology. And if you have taken an Uber or a Lyft, then you're already familiar with the idea of this technology. And that is that you can use your mobile device to place a same-day reservation. And it offers a lot of flexibility. You could choose to ride by yourself. You could choose to ride in a shared setting, maybe to get a discount on your ride. But technology companies are providing these sorts of platforms to public transit companies. And that provides a lot of interesting opportunities, not only to subsidize transportation to make it more affordable for folks, but counties could also provide targeted programs. If there was a particular rehabilitation program and they wanted to offer rides specifically to members of that program, that's something that we could work with counties to do using that technology. But I think one of the most exciting things about it is it helps fill this gap between the urban cores and the rural areas. And I'm really excited to see how that's going to pan out in a suburban setting, especially because with a fixed route service, the cost of investing in a service is so high, because you're going to have that bus out there, you're going to have that driver on the road running the schedule you've published, regardless of whether there are people riding the bus or not. It's very expensive. So you've got to do a lot of planning and a lot of research to make sure that you're putting that somewhere where you're going to have that ridership. But with these on-demand platforms, testing out a new service can be as simple as drawing some polygons on a map in the software, and then you can publish it. And if you were wrong and nobody wants to ride that service, then nobody will put in any trip requests. And if you've got a fleet of vehicles moving around, none of the vehicles will be dispatched to do those trips. So the cost of experimentation is much, much lower. So I'm really excited to see what kinds of possibilities that's going to create as we test this new kind of transit in different settings.
Todd, just offering an opportunity. Would you like to jump in here?
Yeah, so I totally agree. I also like to remind everybody that pretty much every transit trip also has walking and bicycling links. So certainly we want new transportation innovations, and we also want incentives for people to choose the most efficient mode for each trip. And we want integration, and part of that integration should be including walking, making sure that the areas that people are traveling to, that you're taking the bus or a taxi, a micro transit, it still ends up being a good walkable area. So these all fit together very nicely.
I'd like to respond to that, if you don't mind.
Absolutely, Stephen. Sure.
Yeah, so I think Todd raises a really good point that with these innovative technologies, we still need to be looking at the land use side. And if we go back to that rural setting, which I said that's not a good candidate for fixed route, But if we were innovative in our planning and land use approaches, it's possible that we could develop some of these walkable nodes like Todd is describing. And maybe each of those nodes is large enough that we would deploy one of those on-demand services to help people circulate through that node. But then maybe we could pair that with a fixed route service that could connect those nodes like a string of pearls. And where you typically wouldn't have fixed route in a rural setting, maybe then it makes sense if we're pairing it with some innovative land use and some innovative new transportation technology.
So let me ask a question then, Stephen, and then I'll ask Todd the same thing. And you may have just alluded to it. Is there one thing that governments can do to make these connections easier? Stephen, you first.
If you don't mind, I'll pass the baton to Todd while I think about that.
Okay.
Sure. Well, this is really all about integration. So integration between different modes and integration between transportation and land use. And the term we use is planning. It requires good planning. Governments have control over space. They have control over road right-of-way, so they can determine, for example, where a road is going to have sidewalks and bike lanes and parking lanes and bus lanes and general traffic lanes, and the design speed for those facilities. Governments also control zoning and determine where you can have, say, townhouses and apartments, or where they're forbidden. Governments control, make decisions about parking requirements, parking minimums, and that has very large economic implications and fairness implications for those households. That it's the zoning codes currently in most communities, they're assuming everybody owns a car and everybody drives everywhere, and so they require everybody to pay for parking, off-street parking, even if they don't own a car. So there's implications there. And governments also control the public transit services. So you can start off looking at the degree that those current planning decisions favor automobiles over other forms of transportation, and favor dispersed development over more compact, walkable neighborhoods. And you can say, or you can turn this into a more positive frame, and you can ask, what would it take so we can ensure that anybody who wants to buy a house or rent a house in a walkable urban neighborhood can find the affordable housing in the areas that serve the needs of non-drivers? Or you could say that ensure that you can find the combination of affordable housing and affordable transportation that mesh together. And that's planning. The interesting detail is that until the middle of the last century, that was standard. Most houses were built in walkable urban neighborhoods. So we don't need to reinvent anything. We just need to recognize that many people want to live in those neighborhoods, in those types of walkable mixed use neighborhoods, and make sure that we're building lots more of them.
Okay, great. Stephen, did you want to add anything? I saw you unmuted yourself.
Yeah, happy to riff on that a little bit. I think if there's one thing local government can do, it would be to acknowledge the diversity of actors that are required to really make successful and compelling transportation options for the community. So obviously at Jaunt, we're in charge of the part of that journey that involves the bus. We want to make sure they're on time. We want to make sure our drivers are professional and safe and courteous. We want to make sure we've planned our schedules accordingly. But we also rely on the county staff when they're doing their land use plans, because as Todd mentioned, they're the ones controlling space. We want to work with the developers who are developing each individual parcel, because they're going to be responsible for suitable bus stop locations and what the amenities will be And the experience will be, and the walkability will be when they get off the bus and they need to get to the store or the church or whatever it is. We need to work with the elected officials, because as professionals, we're here to provide options, but it's really the responsibility of the elected officials to help champion what is the vision of the community, and what are the decisions ultimately that will be made. So there's a lot of different actors that all need to come together in a coordinated way if we want to have successful outcomes.
Great, thank you. And I'm watching my time, and I think, Keith, we are pretty close to starting the Q&A portion.
I think, Diantha, I've been tracking some of the questions, and some of the responses from Stephen and Todd are kind of touching a little bit on some of the questions in the feed. So I think, what are we up to, question number 5, if I count my count right from you?
I can go to question 6 if you think we have time.
Let's do that. Let's do that,
That's
because some of the questions are being touched in the responses, and then we'll jump in and kind of ask a couple of questions. I think another few minutes would be great.
That's great. Sounds good. So the last question that I have is, what are the 1 or 2 things that we should think about, issues to consider when we're planning in our community for new residential development? Because we're all experiencing lots of growth and lots of new development. So what would be, Todd, for you, the 1 or 2 things that we should think about when planning?
Right. I guess 2 things. One is respond to the diversity of housing demands. So one thing, there was a question, one of the questions that came up asked about whether communities should be concerned because higher density housing for low income people can create problems and resistance. And that's one of the things that I want to emphasize, is that dense housing, so townhouses and low-rise apartments, are not just for low-income people. There are many medium and high-income people who want that type of housing. And so it isn't, I would emphasize the value of mixed income neighborhoods. So a good community is all mixed up. It means that you're mixing up the land uses. So you've got housing and stores and parks and schools all close together within walking distance. And it also has mixed incomes, that you're not creating some neighborhoods that are low income and some neighborhoods that are high income, that you're actually creating true complete communities where it's perfectly normal for low income households and higher income households to live next to each other, and for their children to go to the same schools, and everybody walks their dogs to the local dog park, and it all fits together. So that's the first thing, is making sure we're not in our thinking assuming that that compact development, compact housing types are only for one type of person. The other point is to understand the complexity of accessibility, and to constantly ask ourselves, how can we make sure that people who cannot drive or shouldn't drive, maybe they're, let's say, an alcoholic, or they have a bad driving record, and we want them to stop driving, and also people who don't want to drive. So in most communities, there are a large number of people, especially young people, who could own a car and could devote their time to driving, but prefer not to. They prefer the exercise and the experience and the cost savings of getting around, primarily by walking and bicycling and public transit. Okay, so ask yourself, are we creating the communities to serve those demands, to serve people who don't want to live automobile dependent lifestyles, and making sure especially that those neighborhoods, those multimodal compact mixed use neighborhoods have sufficient affordable housing, but not think of it as this is the low income neighborhood or this is the token mixed use neighborhood. No, I think you'll find in most cities, a very significant portion of households do want to live in walkable urban neighborhoods. And some of those are going to be low income, but some of them will be medium and high income.
So Todd, I'm going to jump in and ask a question that I just saw in the feed that's kind of relevant to this question. And Stephen, we'll get back to you in a second so you can respond to the question. Gives you more time to think. So there's a question, I'm just going to paraphrase the question in the feed. You know, in my world, I'm a practicing real estate agent. The COVID has really impacted how people live in today's world, right? And this work from home. Are you starting to see this in these other parts of the country that you work in, that this work from?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And is that going to change the conversation going forward?
It can. Of course, there are various narratives. There are the preppers who think that the best way to avoid any disaster is to have a bunker in the middle of nowhere. But it actually turns out that is for most people, let's say for anybody who is not an antisocial.
Well, I heard they all go to British Columbia, by the way. That's
well, there are pockets of them all over the place. But the point is, it turns out that most people that in terms of minimizing contagion risk and maximizing health opportunities, that living in a compact, walkable neighborhood is overall the best because you're minimizing the time you're in an enclosed vehicle. So walking in the neighborhoods that are truly pedestrian and bike oriented actually tend to have the lower infection rates than places that are more automobile oriented. It is not certainly rural area. It took a lot longer for infections for COVID infections to become common in rural areas. But once they got established there, they were equally severe. And because rural areas tend to have fewer medical facilities, so it takes longer to get to medical services. And there's less specialized medical services. There are whole counties that have no intensive care units. So actual death rates are lower in big cities than they are in rural areas. So the lesson from, there are many lessons that you can extract from our current pandemic, but one of them to me is, again, the value of living in a walkable urban neighborhood where you can get those services nearby without having to drive everywhere. Now, there's another aspect of that, and that is, as you mentioned, a lot of people are working at home. If you're needing a UPS delivery, if you're in a city that the delivery is no problem at all, you can get those urgent documents or those printer cartridges or whatever you need, no problem. In suburban areas, you're going to have less frequent service, and sometimes you have to pay a small premium. You have to pay extra. In the rural areas, UPS charges as much as $100 extra for any delivery in the most rural areas. They just don't serve. There are lots of places where courier services and other regular, and other deliveries simply won't serve in rural areas. Ask your local pizza restaurant, and they probably only serve the urban areas. So for all of those reasons, there's a certain logic. If you want to prepare for the next pandemic, one of the best things you can do is make sure that you have a very comfortable house with your home office and a lot of good ventilation, and that it's in an area where you don't need to drive a lot, and that you can get frequent deliveries. What do you think, Keith? Does that ring true to you?
Yeah, we're seeing a little bit different in our marketplace, but I thank you for tackling it. Diantha, if you don't mind picking up some questions from here, if you don't mind, if I can pick them up.
Absolutely. I'm keeping an eye on our time. And we
Got
want
it. Yes, ma'am. So Stephen, I just want to take that question and kind of put it in your world a little bit, right? You're a practitioner. You're in the business of providing services. You know, just to kind of talk about a little bit about how COVID has impacted the transit world. Talk about that a little bit, and talk about how do you see where that's going in the long term, because we have some planners and decision makers here, and this should be part of their thinking. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, I think that it will have an effect. What that effect will be at this point, I think, is anybody's guess. I know here at Jaunt, our most important takeaway is that we really saw COVID affect our different communities and our different ridership bases differently. So one service we operate is the Crozet Connect, and that is serving Crozet. It's a community with a lot of professionals who work at UVA. And we saw a dramatic decrease in ridership when we went under quarantine. And I think that reflects the ability of that population to work remotely. But we didn't see that across the board with all of our services. Buckingham Connect is another service that we operate that connects to the University of Virginia area. But that service tends to get used by a lot more blue collar workers. And when we went into quarantine, we saw virtually no decline in the ridership of our Buckingham Connect service. So clearly those riders didn't have the opportunity to work remotely. And because we had reduced capacity on our vehicles to promote social distancing, we actually had to deploy additional transit resources to make sure that we could supply all of the transportation that was needed by that community to have those workers continuing to come into the university. So it's gonna be a while before we know what the effect was. I think it's going to be different for different communities. And I think we need to look at it at both the micro level of how is our region being affected, but also the macro level. Our new remote working opportunities allowing employees in Washington, D.C. or even further abroad to relocate to Charlottesville, you know, the top rated community to live in Newsweek or whenever that was, because they have that option now. What kinds of shifts are we going to see as a result of that? I'm not sure.
Thanks, Stephen. So there's a ton of questions coming in the feed. I'm trying to take some notes here. So I'm gonna try to consolidate some of them. So if I don't quite get the question exactly the way you asked it, please don't be offended. It wasn't intentional. I'm just trying to be conscious of the next 5 or 10 minutes that we have here. But to kick off kind of the next series of questions that I've kind of correlated from the feed, I'm going to start with you, Todd. When we had our meeting here to talk about what we were going to do today, you said something that resonated with me, and I just would like to explore a little bit on it. It might go to some of the questions in the feed, and that was, you know, we're not the only ones dealing with this, right? This is a nationwide, international, right? You're sitting in Canada at the moment. Wide situation. So talk a little bit, and there's a bunch of questions in here about how the planning departments, the local governments, the board of supervisors, and you guys kind of touched a little bit on this, on tackling, you know, this is a really big issue, and how are other jurisdictions doing it? And, you know, and I'm going to kind of ask a couple of follow-up questions along that way, but I'd like you to kind of take this from a more macro perspective, and it might help us a little bit on the local level. Does that make any sense?
Sure. And just for clarity, when you say this issue, I assume we're talking about affordability.
Well, so my personal opinion, you know, when we discuss affordable housing, there's always these things that are connected. It's the physical portion of affordable housing density and all this stuff, transportation, which is we're talking about now, medical and education. That they're all, you can't separate the one from the other.
Sure.
But we're talking about transit at this particular point, so maybe tied around transit.
Right. Okay. So. Yes, planners have a critical role to play. It's, to put it modestly, planners' job is to help create paradise on earth. It's not an easy job. but nobody else is doing it. I mean, certainly public officials like you are some of you are leaders in the policy, but the day-to-day management and coordination, that's in the realm of the planning professionals. So the good news is I think we have some terrific solutions that if, for example, unaffordability is a problem. So when people say they can't afford healthy food, or they can't afford their medical care or medicine, or they're having trouble financing their children's education, what they're really saying is we're spending too much on housing and transportation, because those are the two largest expenditures in most household budgets. And if we can deliver more affordable housing and transportation, we're giving people freedom. We're giving them control over their budget. Okay, so that's a positive way to frame this. Similarly, we can say that we have ways that can create healthier and safer neighborhoods. We do know people who live in walkable neighborhoods and less automobile dependent neighborhoods have lower traffic accident rates and are healthier. They're exercising more. So there are some positive ways to frame this. And I think it is up to us, the policymakers and the planners, to communicate these benefits to the various audiences. So for example, on Monday, I might be meeting with public health officials, and they're interested in how to create healthier and safer communities. And we can talk about the benefits of good planning for that. And on Tuesday, I might be meeting with the local business community, the Chamber of Commerce, and I'll be able to talk about how some smart planning policies can reduce the cost of development and help businesses attract more customers and more better employees. And on Wednesday, I might be meeting with environmentalists who are concerned about climate emissions. And we can demonstrate that good planning and certain types of neighborhoods have far lower emissions per capita. And on Thursday, I might be meeting with the traffic engineers, and they're interested in reducing traffic congestion and infrastructure costs, road and parking infrastructure costs. And those are other reasons that we should create communities where people don't have to drive as much and can rely more on walking, bicycling, and public transit for some of their trips. And on Friday, you get the story, you get the idea. On Friday, I might be meeting with the real estate agents, and I might point out that a house in a compact neighborhood is actually a better product for many households, and we can talk about that. So I just want to give the idea that good planning can provide large, diverse benefits. It's up to us to build a coalition, the policy, the political coalition, where the various players, the public health officials are working with the Chamber of Commerce, are working with environmental agencies, that are working with transportation agencies, that we're all working together for this vision of more affordable housing in compact, walkable neighborhoods so that we're satisfying everybody's needs.
So as I'm watching the feed, I think what I'm reading is, okay, how do we do this, right? You know, this is a great conversation to have. We're talking about this, but, you know, how can we as planners, how can we as local officials, how can we, you know, as folks that are or have stakeholders in this, how can we actually achieve this? Now, Steve, I'm going to pivot that question a little bit to you. And again, I apologize to all. I'm trying to consolidate a lot of great questions into something a little bit more compact on it. So Stephen, you want to take a little tackle on that question? How do we do this?
Happy to. So it is a really challenging problem. You can do a Google search for wicked problems. There's a lot of writing on that. But this is not neat and tidy. There's not one optimal solution. As somebody in the feed mentioned, you know, there's a real diversity of jurisdictions and communities that might have different or even competing ideas.
Well, one that was, while you mentioned it, one that was just interrupting, one that was very interesting that caught my eye was the social factor thing. And I never really realized that till that question was asked, that we as a society kind of don't look favorable on folks taking buses or me getting on my bike or anything like that. And maybe you might want to chat a little bit about that.
Yeah, as I was saying, it's a real challenge. And, you know, are we going to deliver that paradise on earth that Todd was describing? Absolutely not. Planning is a process of compromise. And hopefully by working together, we're going to be able to deliver something that's a pretty nice place to live. And there's a lot of different ways that we're trying to do that in the community today. I get a lot of joy out of working at Jaunt. We serve the city of Charlottesville and 6 counties. And so we get to work with a really wide diversity of different types of people. We have a membership on our board from each of those localities, and they help us to understand what are the priorities of their communities and what kind of services can we help offer them. Charlottesville and Albemarle are working together through the regional transit partnership to try to help build a cohesive vision there of how Jaunt and Charlottesville Area Transit and UTS can all work together to provide a cohesive transit system for the residents of Charlottesville and Albemarle. And of course, this webinar is being hosted by the Planning District Commission. So that's another venue where we can try to bring together a lot of different actors and try to find those compromises and find that middle ground. I will say that one of the unsolved problems in planning is how best to do community engagement. You go through planning school and they teach you how to run a public meeting, but the fact of the matter is people are busy and they have a lot of things competing for their time. And so I think that remains an unsolved problem of what is a truly game-changing, revolutionary way that in the modern day, we could genuinely engage our community and to have a community that more easily sees the value of spending some of their free time to contribute to those kinds of conversations.
So we're coming up close to the end of our Q&A session, and I'm probably going to take a moment and get on my soapbox as the chairman of the Regional Housing Partnership. Go figure. There was a script in here that said, Smith, don't do that. I'm going to do it anyway. So it's I think the important lesson to learn from here, I'm looking at how many folks are on here. We were roughly at 60 plus or minus going in here. This is how this conversation gets forward. This is how we solve this problem, by having these type of discussions with different folks from different spheres of influence at the table. Regional housing, you mentioned the Thomas Jefferson Planning District Commission, which is part of the Regional Housing Partnership, which is what I chair. So the folks who are listening, who not are familiar with the structure of it, what we do is we bring the 4 pillars of what I call a healthy housing system together. For those who've heard this speech before, I apologize. So we have all the elected jurisdictions there. We have all the nonprofits in the space. We have all the for-profits in the space, and we have the people who we serve at the space. We also have the 20-ton elephant in the room in our area, which is UVA at the table. So thank you for everybody joining. We're about 1 minute out left. I know you guys have been tracking the feed. Is there anything that real quickly you want to jump in and try to answer any of the questions or make any comments on something that's in the feed? And Todd, if you want to start with that real quick, that would be great.
Sure. Well, half of what you need is good data. And I'll put a link on a study that we did in our region that looked at the combined housing and transportation costs to households here that you might want to use as an example for some research you'll do. But the other half of the challenge is about storytelling, to find those stories that really communicate, that resonate with your audiences. So good planners, we're data geeks and we sit around and measure things, but we also have to do a good job about, let's say, paint a word picture of what your community could be, how you could improve your community and solve problems if you do implement good planning.
Stephen, would you like to wrap up with something real quick?
Scrolling through, and
well, I know you've got a specific question for Green, but I think you'll email that person directly. It's a fellow commission member. So if you wouldn't mind answering that question offline, I'd appreciate it.
Sure. Well, I think there are at least two people who have touched on this sort of intersection of social factors with transportation. So, is there tension in the community around somebody who's choosing to bike on a rural road and somebody who disagrees with that? Or another example was some people who feel it's appropriate for children to walk some distance from their home unsupervised, and other members of the community might call Child Protective Services. So that is something that I am really interested in. It's not something that I have a lot of experience dealing with. So maybe Todd has something to share on that, or maybe Diane.
Well, unfortunately, we're getting close to our time here, folks. And I wish we had another hour, because we probably would just do this for another hour. But first and foremost, I want to thank all the three of you. Diantha, thank you. You're a pro. Todd, thank you for calling in from Vancouver Island, I think, if I got it right. So you're up there 3 hours before us, and we might see each other when I go visit my daughter in Seattle here soon. So thank you for doing that. And Stephen, man, you're a rock star in the transportation space. Please keep the work up. And there was something in the feed about inter-county workings, and you guys handle all our jurisdictions. So thank you for everything that you guys do to bring us forward in it. This is a high level topic. This is a great topic to talk about. We will surely have more to follow on this. Stacy, I'm going to let you chime in the last minute, because in my notes I do not have what our last session is, so I apologize.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks, Keith. Next month, and I believe the date is June 17th, same time, we will be having a session on equity and housing. It will be another panel discussion. We're still working out the exact people to be on the panel, but it will be led by Siri Russell, Albemarle County's Director of Equity and Inclusion Office. So we hope that you will join us then.
So before I wrap up, I want to give an extra special thank you to Christopher Bremett from Bramante Homes for sponsoring this. Happens to be a personal friend of mine. He's a great guy. If you're in the space, give him a call. They will take care of you if you're interested in a custom home. So Christopher, if you're online, thank you very much for sponsoring us. I think we've got about 15 seconds. So Diantha, would you like anything to add before we wrap up?
I would just like to thank our panelists as well as everybody who joined us today, and hope to and look forward to seeing you next month.
And staff, right?
Absolutely.
They keep us straight, at least me anyway.
Absolutely do.
Not you. You're a rock star, so they don't have to keep you straight. I've got to bring Dalai Lama with me to meetings like this, so I can stay on track. So thank you very much, guys. Have a great thing. Todd, thank you very much. Stephen, thank you very much. Christopher Bremett, Bronte Homes, thank you very much. Staff, thank you. Diantha, again, you're a rock star. Thank you, folks.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.
We're good?